"You're just a nurse. Surely you know somebody who can help lower this hospital bill." Those were my own brother's words. Standing in that hospital corridor, right after our father was admitted, he didn't hesitate for even a second before saying it to my face. What he didn't know was that I had walked those exact halls for the past 8 years. Not as some ordinary staff member. I was the person who actually ran that entire hospital. For 30 years, my family had only ever seen me as a girl in scrubs. Quiet, ordinary. Someone who'd never really accomplished anything worth mentioning. Meanwhile, my brother wore his expensive suits and stood at the center of every family gathering. I never said a word. I let them believe whatever they wanted to believe. But the day our father was rushed into that hospital, and my own siblings stood there worrying about his medical bills, assuming I had no real power to do anything at all, that's the day something inside me finally broke. The next morning, I walked into my father's room, and for the first time, instead of hiding my identification badge, I let it hang out in plain view. And then, something happened that none of them could have ever imagined. If you love stories about family neglect and finally reclaiming your self-worth, stay with me until the very end, because what happened next changed our entire family forever. If this story moves you, please subscribe to this small channel of ours. It genuinely means so much to us. My name is Margaret Ellison, and for most of my adult life, my family believed I was simply a nurse, a kind woman in scrubs who worked long shifts and never quite amounted to much more than that in their eyes. I grew up in a small town in Ohio, the middle child between my older brother, Richard, and my younger sister, Diane. From the very beginning, Richard was the one my parents pointed to with pride. He went to business school. He wore suits. He talked about numbers and deals at every family dinner, and my father would lean back in his chair and beam, like Richard had personally hung the moon. I went into nursing school instead, because I genuinely loved caring for people. But in my family, that choice was treated like a quiet disappointment. My mother used to sigh and say, "Well, at least it's steady work," as if I'd settled for something small. For 30 years, I built a career in healthcare administration, working my way up from bedside nursing into hospital management. I won't bore you with every step of that climb, but I will tell you this. By the time I turned 55, I had become the chairwoman of the board at Ellison Memorial, one of the largest hospital systems in our state. Yes, Ellison Memorial, named after my late husband's family, who had donated the land decades earlier. I sat on that board quietly, making decisions that affected thousands of patients every single year, and I never once mentioned it at a single family gathering. Why did I keep it quiet? Honestly, it started small. My family had already decided who I was. The nurse. The plain one. The one who wasn't ambitious like Richard. Every time I tried to share something about my work, someone would change the subject to Richard's latest business venture, or Diane's beautiful new kitchen renovation. So eventually, I just stopped trying to be seen. I let them believe what they wanted to believe, and I focused on the work that actually mattered to me. Richard, meanwhile, had spent the last decade running a mid-sized logistics company that, from the outside, looked wildly successful. Big house. New cars every couple of years. Country club membership. My parents adored him for it. At every holiday dinner, my father would raise a glass and toast to his son, the businessman, while I sat quietly at the end of the table, refilling everyone's water glasses, because, in their minds, that's simply what I did best. I want to pause here for just a moment, because before I tell you what happened next, I'd be so grateful if you'd take just a second to subscribe to this small channel of ours. It genuinely helps more than you'd think, and I promise, there's a meaningful story waiting for you at the end of this one. Now, let's get back to it. Everything changed on a Tuesday afternoon in March, when my father collapsed in his garden and was rushed by ambulance straight to Ellison Memorial. I got the call from Diane, while I was in a board meeting downtown. Her voice was frantic, barely coherent, telling me Dad had collapsed, and they didn't know how bad it was. I left that meeting immediately and drove straight to the hospital. My hospital, though of course, nobody in my family thought of it that way. By the time I arrived, my father was stable, but in serious condition, admitted for observation, and a series of tests that would take days, possibly longer. Richard was already there, pacing the hallway in his expensive coat, barking questions at every nurse who passed by, demanding answers nobody could give him yet. The next few days were a blur of test results, specialist consultations, and mounting hospital bills. My father needed an extended stay, along with a specialized treatment plan that frankly wasn't cheap. And that's when Richard's true colors started to show. He cornered me in the family waiting room on the third day, his voice sharp with frustration. "Margaret, we need to talk about these bills. Do you have any idea how much this is costing?" I called billing, and they said the extended care wing runs almost $4,000 a day. Dad doesn't have that kind of insurance coverage. I asked him calmly what he wanted me to do about it, and his response still echoes in my mind. "Well, you work here, don't you? Can't you talk to someone? Pull some strings? Get a discount? Something? You're just a nurse, but surely you know somebody who can help." Just a nurse. After 30 years of building a career he'd never once bothered to ask about. That's how my own brother summed me up, right there in a hospital hallway, while our father lay in a bed one floor above us. Diane chimed in too, suggesting I could perhaps pick up extra shifts to help cover the costs myself, since apparently my modest nursing salary was the only resource anyone assumed I had access to. Nobody asked what I actually did for a living anymore. They'd simply stopped being curious about me decades ago. I stood there in that hallway, listening to my siblings discuss my father's care as though I were nothing more than hospital staff they happened to be related to, and something inside me went very quiet and very still. I didn't argue with them that day. I simply nodded, told them I'd see what I could find out, and walked away toward the elevator that would take me up to the administrative floor, the floor where my actual office had been for the past 8 years. What Richard and Diane didn't know, standing in that hallway complaining about billing rates, was that every single decision about my father's care, his treatment plan, his extended stay, even the billing structure itself, ultimately ran through my desk. I wasn't just someone who worked at Ellison Memorial. I was the person who had the final say over how this entire hospital operated. That evening, I called an emergency meeting with our chief financial officer and the head of patient billing. Not to punish my brother for his ignorance, but because I genuinely wanted to review my father's case properly, the same way I would for any patient whose family was struggling to understand the costs involved. I discovered that the billing department had, in fact, made an error, charging my father for a private suite upgrade nobody had actually authorized. I corrected it myself, personally signing off on the adjustment, and arranged for his care to continue under our hospital's family assistance program, something available to any patient's family, if only someone had bothered to ask the right questions, instead of assuming a nurse in the family had no real influence at all. The next morning, I walked into my father's hospital room, wearing my hospital identification badge, the one that read Margaret Ellison, Board Chairwoman, clearly visible on my blazer, for the first time in front of my entire family. Richard was already there, still complaining loudly to a nurse about the billing department's incompetence. He turned when I walked in, his eyes catching the badge on my chest before his brain fully processed what he was reading. "Margaret, what is that? Since when do you wear an ID like that?" I calmly explained that I had served as chairwoman of the hospital board for the past 8 years, that every decision regarding billing adjustments, treatment authorizations, and family assistance programs ultimately came across my desk, and that I had, just last night, personally corrected the billing error he'd been so upset about. The color drained from Richard's face almost instantly. Diane, standing near the window, simply stared at me in stunned silence, as though seeing me clearly for the very first time in her life. "You're telling me," Richard said slowly, "that you run this hospital? That you've been sitting on that board this entire time, and you never once said anything?" I told him the truth. Gently, but honestly. I told him I stopped sharing my achievements years ago because nobody in our family had ever seemed genuinely interested in hearing them. I told him that just because I chose nursing over business school didn't mean I had settled for anything small, and that the assumption I couldn't possibly know how to, in his words, pull some strings, said far more about how little he'd bothered to know me than it ever did about my own worth. My father, resting quietly in his hospital bed throughout this entire exchange, reached his hand toward mine and squeezed it gently. He told me, in a tired but sincere voice, that he was proud of me, and that he was deeply sorry it had taken a hospital bed for him to finally understand what his daughter had actually built with her life. In the weeks that followed, my father made a full and steady recovery. Our family dynamic didn't transform overnight. These things rarely do. But something did shift permanently that day in that hospital room. Richard started asking real questions about my work for the first time in his adult life. Diane began calling just to talk, rather than only reaching out when she needed something. I never sought recognition from my family for the career I built. I built it because I genuinely loved caring for people, and later, because I wanted to help shape a hospital system that treated every family, not just the ones who knew the right things to ask, with dignity and honesty. But I'll admit, there was a quiet kind of peace in finally being fully seen by the people who had spent decades looking right past me. If this story touched you even a little today, I would be so grateful if you'd take a moment to like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe to this small channel of ours. It genuinely means the world to us, and there are so many more stories just like Margaret's still waiting to be shared with you. Thank you so much for spending this time with me, and I'll see you very soon in the next story. If this story touched your heart today, even just a little, please know how much it means to us that you took the time to watch it all the way through. If you believe, like I do, that quiet people often carry the biggest hearts and the strongest strength, I would be so incredibly grateful if you would take just a moment to hit that subscribe button. It truly makes a difference for this small channel of ours, more than you probably realize. And if you have a moment, please leave a comment below and tell me, has there ever been a time in your own life when someone finally saw you for who you really are? I would love to hear your story too. If this touched you, please give it a like, and consider sharing it with someone who might need to hear it today. Thank you, from the bottom of my heart, for spending this time with me and with Margaret's story. There are so many more stories just like this one still waiting for you, and I would be so honored to have you back for the next one.